When the Ottomans won, the battlefield did not end in silence. It ended in chains. The men who fought were slaughtered or enslaved. But the true terror fell on their wives. For them, survival was worse than death. They were not simply prisoners. They were commodities. The Ottomans had perfected a system where women captured in war were stripped of identity and turned into property. It wasn't random pillage, and it wasn't chaos. It was law codified, organized, written into the empire's machinery. Before we dive in, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next descent into history's darkest corners. These women had a name under Islamic jurisprudence: sabaya, spoils of war, and the Ottomans applied the rule with chilling efficiency. The process began immediately. Specialized officers entered captured cities and separated people with ruthless precision. Men, women, and children were divided like livestock. The wives of fallen warriors faced a degrading inspection. Ottoman doctors and officials examined them head to toe, testing teeth, checking bodies, calculating fertility. Their age, beauty, and health determined their price. Young women with striking features were marked for Constantinople. Older ones were condemned to heavy labor or discarded into obscurity. It was an industry of humiliation. A noble woman who once carried respect could be handled like cattle. Her body prodded in the open streets. Her value shouted out like a number. The nightmare only worsened on the road. Long columns of captives chained together were forced to march for weeks. Some collapsed from hunger or exhaustion and were left to die on the roadside. Others were crammed into wagons like sacks of grain. Reaching the markets alive was already a form of survival. But what awaited was worse. The slave markets of the Ottoman world were not secret lawless dens. They were official institutions regulated and taxed by the state. In Constantinople, Bursa, and Anara, women were lined up for inspection under the eyes of eager buyers. Buyers could touch, examine, even test them before making an offer. A woman's skills were put on display like tools at a stall: sewing, weaving, cooking. If she failed to impress, she was beaten or priced down. There was no dignity left. The humiliation was the point. Women were forced to smile under threat, to show obedience, to act as though they had already accepted their fate. Behind them, scribes recorded everything: names, origins, ages, values. These ledgers of misery filled Ottoman archives. The most beautiful captives faced the darkest fate. They were funneled into the empire's harems. Forget the later myths of silk and luxury and forbidden romance. The harem was a gilded cage, a prison wrapped in gold. Inside Topkapi Palace, thousands of women from every conquered land were held in confinement, competing for survival under the watch of eunuch guards. Language, faith, even names were stripped away. A Christian woman from Hungary or Greece would wake up one morning renamed, forced to speak Ottoman Turkish, forced to adopt Islamic rituals. Refusal was punished with starvation, whipping, or isolation in blackened cells. The harem was not just sexual exploitation. It was psychological annihilation. Women fought for scraps of influence, knowing that favoritism could mean protection and survival, while rejection meant abuse or death. Many never adapted. Some descended into madness. Others took their own lives in desperation. The harem was not paradise. It was a graveyard for identity. For the wives of important men, the torment was even sharper. If their husbands were commanders or nobles, they were often forced to serve the very officers who had destroyed their families. Their degradation was intentional. It sent a message: if the noble women of your land can be broken, no one is safe. Resistance would always end with humiliation. The cruelty was systematic. Imperial scribes registered every detail: a woman's origin, her skills, her beauty, her price. It was the ultimate bureaucracy of dehumanization. To the empire, these women were numbers in a ledger, proof of power written in ink. But the Ottoman machine did not stop at enslavement. It went further. Captive women became producers of the next generation of slaves. Any child born of an enslaved mother automatically belonged to the master. Mothers were forced to raise children they could never truly call their own, knowing the empire could rip them away at any time. The womb itself became another tool of exploitation. And when even this was not enough, religion was turned into a weapon. Captive Christian women were dragged into forced conversions. Ceremonies that had nothing to do with faith and everything to do with domination. Refusal meant torture. Acceptance meant the final severing of ties to their families, their culture, their entire past. Conversion made escape meaningless. Even if a woman ran, she could never return home. She had been erased legally and spiritually. This was how the Ottomans turned conquest into permanence. The battlefield might last weeks, but the fate of the women stretched for generations. Their bodies became extensions of the empire's power. Their children born into chains. Their identities systematically obliterated. And yet, this is only half the story. Because the Ottomans were not satisfied with domination in private. They weaponized humiliation in public, turning the suffering of these women into a warning carved into the memory of every conquered people. What came next was darker still. Forced conversion was not about saving souls. It was about breaking them. Women were marched into humiliating rituals where priests of their faith were absent, their gods mocked, their refusal punished. Refused to recite the Islamic declaration of faith, and they faced starvation, whipping, or confinement in darkness. Accept, and the chains sank deeper. A Christian wife became, in the empire's eyes, a Muslim slave with no path back. Escape to her old community was impossible. Her family would not recognize her. Her church would not take her back. Conversion was a second death. The Ottomans understood that destruction was most effective when it was permanent. That is why they used children as weapons. Enslaved women gave birth to sons and daughters who were never theirs. A newborn was not considered a child of the mother, but property of the master. A boy might be raised as a servant, a soldier, or sold into the janissary system. A girl was marked to replace her mother in the same cycle of sale, humiliation, and confinement. Mothers raised children knowing they were raising the next generation of slaves. Their wombs became tools for empire. The records proved the scale. Ottoman scribes meticulously catalogued captured women, name, age, price, skills. These ledgers piled high in imperial archives, transforming human misery into official documentation. Nothing was random. Every act of brutality was written, stamped, and filed. The empire turned horror into paperwork. And for the wives of powerful enemies, the punishment reached another level. They were not hidden away in markets or harems. They were paraded. Public humiliation broke not just the woman but the community watching her. She became a living reminder that no rank, no nobility, no bloodline could resist Ottoman power. Resistance did happen, but it came at a price. Some women attempted escapes, bribing guards, slipping notes to family, or starving themselves to death as their only act of control. The empire thrived on examples, but the Ottomans were not satisfied with controlling the present. They reshaped entire societies through this system. Entire communities across the Balkans, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East were gutted of women. Generations disappeared. Villages lost their daughters, mothers, and wives, permanently warping the population balance. This was demographic warfare, extermination by removal. The scars lasted centuries. Survivors who somehow escaped or were freed carried their trauma for life. Some could no longer speak their native tongue after years of forced assimilation. Others could not pray in the religion they once cherished. Many were rejected by their own families who saw them as tainted. They returned home as strangers, living evidence of what conquest had done to them. Historians once brushed over these details. They wrote of Ottoman military victories, architecture, administration. They spoke of grandeur and tolerance. But hidden in archives were the receipts of human lives. Ledgers filled with the suffering of women whose names were erased. For centuries, their voices were ignored, buried under the myths of empire. Only in recent decades, with deeper study of primary sources, has the true scale become undeniable, and the efficiency of the system was perhaps its most terrifying feature. This was not chaos. It was order, a structured machine of enslavement designed to run smoothly, endlessly generation after generation. Women became units of value, their suffering legitimized by law, their exploitation sanctified by ritual. The Ottomans exported this cruelty. Their methods influenced other Islamic states, spreading the precedent of regulated slavery, harems, and forced conversion. What they built became a template, one that endured for centuries beyond their empire. This was not just history. It was a model of how a state can strip away humanity while wearing the mask of civilization. Cannon fire destroyed walls, but bureaucracy destroyed lives. One erased stone, the other erased identity. And in this system, no woman was safe. Not even noble women, not even the wives of commanders, not even the children born within palace walls. The empire proved that conquest did not end when the battle was won. It lived on in ledgers, in harems, in generations of enslaved children who would never know freedom. But there was something else. Something that made this system even darker. Something that ensured the suffering of these women was not just physical, not just generational, but eternal in memory. Because the Ottomans didn't just take bodies, they took names. Every woman captured was renamed. Every record stripped her of origin, turning her into Ottoman property on paper. But what if I told you that the Ottoman system of enslavement was not the worst fate? That some women faced punishments so calculated, so sadistic that even the empire's own records struggled to describe them. That truth is darker still. Some women were not sold, not park-led out to harems, not sent to kitchens or markets. They were broken in ways designed purely for spectacle. When cities resisted too long, when commanders defied the Sultan, their wives were singled out. The empire turned them into living warnings. Punishment began with exposure. Captured women were dragged through streets, chained, beaten, and displayed before their conquered communities. Their humiliation was not private. It was policy. A commander's wife might be stripped of her clothing and paraded before the very soldiers who had slaughtered her family. Her body became a banner of defeat. Her torment a lesson to the survivors. Then came branding. Hot irons pressed against skin, burning symbols into flesh, not to mark ownership, but to erase dignity. Others were forced into roles designed to mock their former status. Noble women, once seated beside kings, were made to clean the floors of Ottoman barracks. Wives of military leaders served wine to the officers who butchered their husbands. And it didn't end with humiliation. Some women were deliberately placed in positions where death was slow and public. Locked in iron cages, hung from city gates, they were left to starve in sight of their own people. Their torment dragged on for days. Each hour a living demonstration of the price of resistance. But the darkest fate was reserved for women who bore children of fallen leaders. The Ottomans feared bloodlines. They feared the possibility that one day a son of a defeated commander might rise to reclaim his father's name. So they cut the lineage at its root. Infants were torn from mothers, sold or executed. A mother forced to watch the killing of her child understood immediately. The empire would not allow even the shadow of resistance to survive. For some, torture was methodical. Ottoman officers employed psychological cruelty alongside physical torment. Women were forced to choose between their children. One spared, one killed, so their loyalty would be shattered forever. Others were kept alive only long enough to witness the execution of family members. Their lives prolonged so their suffering could be savored. And all of this was written down, every act, every punishment. The Ottomans documented horror like accountants tallying profits. It was proof of power. But the cruelty went further still. Some women were used as weapons of conquest. A commander's widow might be sent back to her own city under Ottoman control, forced to spread obedience among her people. She walked as a puppet, her survival tied to her betrayal of her past. Communities that looked at her no longer saw a leader's wife. They saw the empire's tool. There were also experiments in degradation. Some women were deliberately starved, then paraded with food dangling just out of reach. Others were forced into fights against one another. Gladiator-like spectacles staged for the amusement of soldiers. The empire did not simply want obedience. It wanted entertainment. Human suffering became sport. Women who refused to convert were dragged into mosques and beaten in front of congregations until they whispered the words of the Shahada. Their broken voices became evidence of submission. For those who still resisted, the empire made their deaths slow, turning executions into drawn-out sermons on the futility of defiance. But perhaps the most chilling punishment was silence. Some women were erased not by death, not by torture, but by complete disappearance. They were taken into secret chambers, confined for years, allowed no contact with the outside world. They did not live. They did not die. They simply ceased to exist. Ghosts swallowed by the empire's machinery, their memory fading even among those who once loved them. Communities were scarred forever. Villages that resisted never forgot the images burned into their minds. Wives of leaders mutilated. Mothers watching their infants slaughtered. Sisters dragged screaming through the streets. And the women who lived, they carried torment into every breath. Survivors described sleepless nights haunted by screams. Bodies that never healed from whips. Minds shattered by choices no human should face. Some never spoke again. Others wandered aimlessly, incapable of recognizing home or kin. Their survival was not a triumph. It was another form of punishment. The cruelty escalated because it worked. Fear traveled faster than armies. Cities surrendered not because walls collapsed, but because word spread of what awaited the women inside. The Ottomans did not need to fight every battle. Sometimes the screams of the conquered were enough to force the next city to open its gates. This was conquest by terror. Not only swords and cannons, but wombs, children, and wives weaponized against entire nations. And yet, there is one final detail, one final layer of horror that seals this history in blood. The empire did not consider this cruelty a crime. It was law. Every act, branding, humiliation, forced conversion, enslavement was legitimized through doctrine and bureaucracy. Judges, scribes, and officials blessed the suffering. The system was not rogue violence. It was sanctioned, organized, legal, which means the destruction of these women was not just tolerated. It was celebrated as order, as civilization, as empire. And that is why the story does not end in the 16th century. It lingers. It echoes. Because once a system proves that absolute domination can be dressed as law, it sets a precedent. Others watched, others copied. The Ottoman system became a template for empire-wide control of women across continents. The wives of defeated warriors were not just victims of a single conquest. They were the foundation of a legacy of exploitation that outlived them, replicated again and again across centuries. And yet there is still one question history never fully answers. What became of the ones erased? The women who vanished into silence, into archives, into graves without names. Their stories are not written. Their fates are not known. Which means the darkest truth of all may be the one we will never uncover. And this is why the story of what the Ottomans did to the wives of defeated warriors still echoes. Not because of how they lived, but because of how completely they were erased.